could truly reflect the image of God. Does not matter whether you believe that or not, they believe that. I remember years ago, for some odd reason,
You're on, Terry.
doing a course with a colleague of mine who was a Methodist minister in 1 Samuel. You might remember along about the 5th chapter. The writer says, God, but that's just a little much for Christians. And so the Methodist person, excuse me, I have a terrible, said, well, this is how they understood mental illness. I said, no, they didn't understand mental illness at all. They didn't know what it was, had no conception of it or anything else. The writer meant God sent an evil spirit upon Saul. If you don't like that, that's your problem. Wasn't the writer's problem. Oh, tons of light. Paul, as all of the early Christians, lived in Judaism of the 1st century. It did not have the kind of reasoning and objectivity that we would like it to, or that the fathers would have liked it. Years ago, Elie Wiesel, who you may know survived the concentration camps. Wiesel's background is that his ancestry was all Hasidim. The Hasidic Jews originated in the 18th century, the founder of which was a gentleman known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. It is amazing that here's this fellow in the 8th, with all the Hasidic rabbis, all the great masters, the good and those who follow. There are all these wonderful stories. One day they're in Moscow, and the next day they're over here, and then they're there. This is the 18th century. There were no jets. Wiesel said, I know, it's not logical. But then a logical Hasidim probably isn't a Hasidim to begin with. Their concern was not our concern. By that, Wiesel didn't mean that the Baal Shem Tov wasn't here today and there the next day. He just meant, that's how it is. Take it for what it says. The pillars of Judaism were the law, the land, the temple, and the Sabbath. Those 4 things. The pillar of the early church, I said to Tom Wright one time, I'm a firm believer that without our own self-offering. Much as Jesus said to the disciples, pick up your cross and follow me. It means ultimately a death to self. And Paul goes on then to say 2 imperatives, one negative, the other positive. Be ye not conformed to the present age. That often gets translated world, but it is ibis. Be not transformed to the present age, but be ye metamorphe. Actually, it's a whole kind of verb for the imperative active of that word, but the base word is metamorphe. Be ye changed from the inside out. all means have your very essence changed by the renewing of your minds, that you might prove what is the good, holy, completely acceptable will. In other words, it is about God's intention for his creation. It's not about punching your ticket for a good house in the heavens above. I once heard a Presbyterian minister years ago, which always fascinated me. He had done a whole sermon series, not unusual for them, on the Creed during Lent, and obviously finished with, I believe in the resurrection of life in the world to come. He said, way too many Christians are interested in the temperature of hell and the furnishings of heaven. That's not what the faith is about. That's not to say that when we pass this life, we're not in the hands of God. It's just to say that things aren't complete until the resurrection. The Holy Spirit is part of God's creative force. Just like the Word, the Spirit was with God at the beginning. And it blew on the waters. They called order out of chaos. The Spirit is always there as part of God's purpose for who we are and what we are. The Trinity, which the Creed is kind of the final outcome, was always about the oneness of God. If the Jews hadn't been so insistent that God was one, we probably would have never developed the doctrine of the Trinity. What got lost, unfortunately, God's oneness of purpose, God's oneness of how this is all supposed to play out. The kind of theology which I'd like to blame on Protestantism, but it's infectious, and especially in the age in which we live, in which God is constantly cleaning up the messes that you and I make. Yes, God's in charge of the world, but people keep fouling it up. I'm not sure that's either scriptural or true. I think God always understood what he was making and creating when he made man. It is not so much about free will as it is about being free to love and to respond to God. In the stories of creation, God walked with Adam. And it was God's intention always to walk with his creation, to be part of their lives and part of their being. The Jews at the best of times understood that they were called to bring that to the whole world. But it is easy when you're hunkered down and barricaded in to forget you were supposed to drain the swamp. It's just how it is. And we're going through that kind of period now, or at least in the world in which you and I live. The church is under great assault. Make no mistakes about it. I grew up, as maybe some of you did, in what was ostensibly a Christian world. Now I have to tell you, it was kind of like the patriotism after 9/11. It was 5 miles wide and about a 1/16 of an inch, maybe not that, deep. It was a fairly shallow kind of Christianity. If it hadn't been, it wouldn't have turned out the way it did. Most people's religion is a lot of folklore with a very thin veneer of dogma. When the fathers were arguing over the creed, they were trying to put that dogma into effect. It would be some time before the creed would find its place in the liturgy in the particular place that we have it. When we wrap up next week, because I want to talk next week in particular about why it is where it is and why it is critical for us, not only as God's people to recite it, but to understand why it's in the most important liturgy that we do, which is the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, the Holy Communion. Because that sacrament is absolutely dependent upon the truth of the resurrection. It makes no sense to say that we meet and are fed by the living, resurrected Christ. If, as Paul said to the Corinthians in the 15th chapter of the first letter, if Christ be not resurrected, we are the most hapless of people and hopeless as well. Because that's exactly what the church said when she finally put this together. She talks about the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Apostolic because it stood in the stead, the bishops stood in the stead of the apostles. I remember teaching that one time, that woman who grew up in the Canadian Anglican Church. She said, I've been an Anglican all my life, never realized the bishops stood in the stead of the apostles. It's the apostolic faith. Catholic meant those who teach the whole truth about Jesus. The kind of addendum about being universal comes out of the Reformation. It wasn't true then, isn't true now. Catholic in Greek, the word Catholic, means whole. If I say I have a Catholic taste in music, doesn't mean I like Gregorian chant, although I happen to. But it means that, I like country and I love jazz and I enjoy classical. That's a Catholic taste. There's some of the modern stuff the kids play. So, they have to admit. I'm not sure Catholic includes that, but okay. That's just age. Or at least that's what my granddaughters told me. So. Now, one of the things that Luke Timothy Johnson did when he put his own book together was look at three words, and I want to quickly look at those for you. The creed begins, we believe. It is the verbal form for the word we often translate as faith. Part of the problem for us in English is, faith is a noun, it's not a verb. Greek just doesn't have that problem. So it is, we trust, we believe, we have faith. This is the faith of the church. It's an outline of the faith. And not surprisingly, that outline really recounts the story from creation to salvation to the last things. Because Christian salvation is impossible without a kind of eschatology, a doctrine of the end. And by that I don't mean the end of time, although that may well be true as well, but the end in terms of purpose. There's a theory that the abuse of language is the beginnings of insanity. The more I watch the world in which I live, because I have more time to watch it, I'm convinced that's true. We just simply don't precisely use even our own language. And we certainly abuse, well, I'm not sure we even know any others, so that's part of the problem. But we get down to the very end. We confess. Interestingly enough, the Greek word means speak with one voice. Homo laguan. Yeah, it's a double understand. Laguan. We speak with one voice. Baptism for the remission, and we all get pedantic sometimes, so let me get more pedantic than I normally am. What the church was confessing was that sin was taken away. It wasn't just forgiven, it was forgotten, which is always difficult. Most of us can forgive, very few of us can forget. But that's really what the church meant. We believe in the remission of sins. We speak with one voice for baptism. And baptism is about, by the way, forgiveness of sins. And that works for little children just as well as adults, because we're all tainted. The image in us, the image of God, has been marred. Mostly by our own volition, but the whole argument about baptism would go away if we would remember that in all cases it's a beginning. Birth is never about an end, it's always about a beginning. So, and then we expect prosdokemen. We expect. We look forward, like literally, to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. In other words, whatever's to come doesn't come until the resurrection. Because we believe the Lord will come again. I'm going to take some time off in November. Chris is going to teach a couple courses, and then you have a parish meeting on the 15th. Starting on the 29th, I'm going to take apart the Johannine prologue for the 4 weeks ahead. And so we'll come at this from a different way. Now, I purposely avoided this. The West put in the filioque clause at the Council of Toledo in the 6th century. They did so because of lingering concerns about Arianism. There is a twofold problem. Now, I have nothing personally against double procession. Augustine argued it as well as me. But the phrase in Latin and the phrase in Greek mean slightly different things. You don't have the energy to sit through me trying to explain that to you, and it doesn't make a twitch bit of difference. Except that the West, as she always does, just arbitrarily put it in and not so much as a by your leave. And the Greeks have always been bitter about it ever since. Very was the beginnings of the real problems between the Greek and the Western Church. Because, as one of my Greek friends said, that's just how the West is. And it is. It's that whole kind of Roman mindset, and I don't mean just Roman Catholic, I mean Roman. We're inheritors of it as well. Where, we're just right, and this is the empire, and you'll do it. And so it has been a source of bitterness for our Greek friends. For that reason, when I do the creed, I drop off the filioque. I just simply don't say it. Out of respect to the Greeks, not because I think I understand why it's there. I understand the difference between Greek and Latin. And our own bishops made a very good statement on it. You can go read it. It's in the handouts that I gave you. The College of Bishops, a resolution concerning the Nicene Creed dated Epiphany of 2013. So we are wound up for the day. I'm wound up. It's time for church.